Good morning, and welcome to this Heritage Foundation webinar. We're thrilled that you joined us today for what I know is going to be a very interesting discussion. My name is Joshua Meservey. I am the Senior Policy Analyst for Africa and the Middle East here at the Heritage Foundation. We need to go through a few housekeeping rules before we get started. You should be seeing a slide there on your screen, but I will read these off for you. The session is being recorded. It will be emailed to you and posted on heritage.org/events within 48 hours. We do encourage participants to submit questions in the question box that you should see on your screen. Please remember when you are asking a question to identify yourself by name and organization. And do feel free to submit those throughout the webinar at any time, and we will take them as we can. A reminder, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so the only voices you'll be hearing are myself and our keynote, of course. So without further ado, I want to say a few brief words about Heritage's position on the Libyan conflict, and then we'll move into the main event. Libya has been in a civil war since 2011, as we all know. I think we also can all recognize that international efforts to which the US has deferred have failed to persuade or pressure the warring sides to strike a sustainable political settlement. Foreign powers freely operate in the country, worsening the conflict, and in the case of American rival Russia, building influence that challenges US national interests. The Heritage Foundation has argued for years and continues to argue that the US must abandon this failed approach to Libya and take leadership of international diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. The US is the country best able to influence the combatants and coordinate foreign powers' Libyan activities. To tell us much more about the situation in Libya is Mr. Mohammed Ali Abdallah. Mr. Abdallah, can you turn on your camera and join us, please? Thank you. I'll give a brief bio for Mr. Abdallah, and then we'll turn it over to him for his remarks. So Mr. Mohammed Ali Abdallah is the political advisor for US affairs to the Libyan government. For a number of years, Mr. Abdallah was a prominent member of the Libyan opposition. In 2012, during the first democratic elections held in Libya in over 4 decades, Mr. Abdallah won a seat in the General National Congress, Libya's parliament. He was elected from the 9th district of Misrata, which is Libya's 3rd largest city. During his term in office, Mr. Abdallah served as the chairman of the Financial Planning, Budget, and Finance Oversight Committee. As a member in the Telecommunications and Transportation Committee, Mr. Abdallah led efforts to establish a regulatory body to oversee the telecom sector. Mr. Abdallah served as president of the National Front Party, which is the 3rd largest political party in Libya, from 2012 to 2017. During the UN-led dialogue process, Mr. Abdallah served as a member of the Political Dialogue Committee, which resulted in the Libyan political agreement, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. He continued to play a significant role in the political dialogue amongst the different political factions and helped de-escalate conflicts, paving the way for consolidation of the Government of National Accord governance and the UN's return to Tripoli. Mr. Abdallah has multiple degrees from the University of Kentucky as well. So we are really, really fortunate to have Mr. Abdallah join us today. And I know I'm personally looking forward to his remarks. I know they're going to be beneficial for everybody. So Mr. Abdallah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thanks for the Heritage Foundation and for everyone who was able to join us today. I hope that everyone is doing well in these difficult times for many different reasons, and that everyone is staying safe. And wishing all of you and your families all the best. So the topic of today, Libya, is in some people's minds is a crisis. In other people's minds, it's an opportunity, positive and negative. So everybody has a different perspective and a different paradigm when looking at the crisis. However, there's some factors that are pretty common and cannot be ignored. So some foundation that needs to be established in order for us to be able to look at what's happening today, in order for us to be able to find a solution. And I think the uniqueness, the unique factors that is is unique to Libya, makes it very difficult to compare or analyze it, trying to correlate it to other conflicts. So it's a very popular thing to do. Many always try to simplify the situation by making analogies as Libya is the next fill in the blank, or if this doesn't happen, then Libya will become just like fill in the blank. However, the social makeup, the geographic location, the political novice, of the Libyan people, the economic factors, and the modern history of very extremely damaging policies provide for a very complex yet ripe opportunity for a rags to riches scenario. So this is something that I think motivates a lot of people who are involved, and more importantly, that's what motivates a lot of Libyans such as myself to be vested in this, despite the complexities and difficulties and the challenges, is because of the rewards that are there, and in addition to the responsibility that is there for those who have endeavored this path. Today's session is not going to dig into the past or history a lot, but I want to focus on the current situation and where do we go from here. A lot of people, look at this from April 4th, 2019 coming forward. That is the first mistake. The onslaught by Haftar's militias represents a key moment in the post-revolution transitional process. However, and it's a very dark and destructive moment, unfortunately, because it cost over 16 or 1700 lives, including innocent civilians, women and children, over 200,000 IDPs and thousands more wounded, and billions and billions of dollars in destruction and lost revenue. However, it was also a moment when reality that many of us knew was exposed to the rest of the world in real time at a very high price, unfortunately. So what was exposed? It was one of the biggest political Ponzi schemes in recent history, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. This is a very important but a costly, like I said, deliverable that we gained from this crisis on April 4th, and that is that Khalifa Haftar's campaign, and backed by many, including, as Josh mentioned, Russia, the UAE, players such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bashar al-Assad, Syria, and even Iran and Jordan and others. This was never a campaign to combat terror or to rid Libya of extremism or extremist militias or combat corruption and political chaos, which are all objectives that all of us want to achieve. However, this campaign was exposed that it was definitely not that. It was actually in reality an attempt to consolidate and activate those evil factions that I described under an oversight of an axis of evil led by or orchestrated by Russia and funded by U.S. allies such as Saudi Arabia and UAE, and supported logistically by other allies such as Egypt and Jordan, unfortunately, which is all of this information is reflected in the in the UN panel of experts reports, as well as other international organizations that have reported on this, including media outlets. Okay, many would ask, how can so many U.S. allies end up being assets that empower a coalition led by Russia and actually includes Iran and Syria? How could that happen? And I think many people in DC right now are scrambling to find answers to this question of, where did it go wrong? While others, and hopefully more of those, are scrambling to put things back in the proper context, and that's where we want to go with. Some of the recent developments, key things that most of you have probably been following the news more now about Libya, but Haftar's ambitions of carrying out a coup, its takeover Libya and becoming the solution, as he sold it for all intents and purposes, has been thwarted, if not completely ended. His militias and mercenaries have been defeated on the outskirts of Tripoli. They've lost control over many cities in the west, pretty much all of them, including Tarhuna, which was his a basket that was his operations center. Al-Wutia Air Base, which was the operations center for many of the mercenaries fighting on his behalf and with him, led by Russia and others. Currently, military operations are being concentrated around by the GNA forces on the outskirts of Sirte in the central area on the Mediterranean. Haftar's backers have either acknowledged his defeat and started looking at alternative plans, or have gone back to the drawing board in order to escalate the crisis to ensure that a stable Libya is never achieved. And then that is the ultimate goal for some players, such as Russia, I think, prolonging the crisis. And I'll talk a little bit about that here shortly. As long as this political vacuum is left by the U.S. government, taking a few steps back is not, that's not reversed and swiftly, the alternative scenarios will only lead to worse outcomes for Libyans and for the U.S. and its allies as well. That would include a strong Russian military presence on the southern Mediterranean. That would include also going to measures such as taking over control over one of the largest natural gas reserves, adding on top of that, that Russia provides most of the natural gas to Europe. Again, this is another opportunity for Russia to put a stranglehold on the Europeans and controlling the pipeline for illegal refugees coming into Europe. So about Russia, very quickly, the objective, I think, as I mentioned, it's basically prolonging the crisis. I don't think it's necessarily to see Haftar come out as a winner or to see the GNA come out as victor here, because at the end of the day, it's a very difficult balance. I think for Russia, it's basically to prolong the crisis to ensure that its traditional rivals don't come out on the with the upper hand here. The intervention in Libya by Russia goes far beyond just Wagner. A lot of people use the company Wagner and the whole Concordia group or that private military company logo. It goes far beyond that. It's a very comprehensive, in-depth, and well thought out campaign of evil. It includes political intervention through a troll bot network, including, everybody's heard of the arrest of Maxim Shugali in May of 2019, who was operating as part of a network. To do that, the recent deployment of 14 fighter jets and different airport bases, and primarily in Al Jufra, in the central zone of Libya. These were assets by Russia relocated from Syria. Intelligence support, active duty, as well as advisors, as well as other operational support has been another method. And then the financial and economic support, including alternative and financial methods such as illegal drug trade, the black market, the oil and others, other minerals, and the illegal printing of currency, which was referenced recently by a study by a C4ADS, and that's something that is continuing as we speak today. So the increase in Russian presence, as I mentioned, that threatens Libya directly. It threatens the U.S. strategy and objectives not only in Libya but in the region. And how does a strong Russian presence on the southern coast of the Mediterranean impact U.S. and its allies? I don't think I have to answer that question. I think it's a huge threat. Finally, what can be done? What is it that needs to be done immediately in order to set the stage for a better scenario going forward? I think first, increase diplomatic pressure on allies to stop the military support, which continues despite the rhetoric and the messaging, including some of the tweets that we see from officials such as Anwar Gargash talking about peaceful solutions and ceasefire, while these weapons continue to flow in, funded by the UAE and other US allies. The second point is sanctioning not only Haftar, but his associates through US Treasury. Haftar is a US citizen, by the way. That's a very often overlooked fact. And it is something that I think, provides the US government a lot more tangible steps to take towards him and his network. So similar to what was done with the Assad regime, the Caesar Law that was adopted by Congress, there is a Libya Stabilization Act that is in the pipeline within the House and the Senate, which has a very strong bipartisan support. We've worked with many people on the Hill. Some of you guys are online, I know, listening. That this particular legislation has a lot of benefits and has a lot of tangible steps that will actually set the stage for a very successful rags to riches story, like I mentioned. And then strong public statements. You guys saw what a phone call in passing by the White House to Haftar did back in April 2019. And then subsequent statements, hopefully, on the right side, by the State Department, Department of Defense, the White House, National Security Council, Ambassador Norland, and then some Congress members as well, primarily Senator Lindsey Graham, Ted Deutsch on the House side, as well as many others. Malinowski has been very vocal as well in the past. So more public statements. A statement by a U.S. official goes far beyond just a press statement. It has a lot of impact, not only internally within Libya, but it has a lot of impact also on the regional players and the proxy players. And then I think, practical and tangible support for the UN political process. Upon securing military insurances, eliminating the threat of, civilian targets, and this is something that we've been able to achieve, thanks to our heroes who are fighting on the ground, the GNA forces are made up of young Libyans who have this aspiration to be part of the success story, and they're sacrificing their lives and everything that they have in order to engage in a process that they set out on in 2011 and unfortunately did not find the right level of support internally and externally to turn this into a successful story. Yet this is still something that is within reach, and the U.S. is the primary, if not the only player that can actually make this a reality in a very, very productive way. Haftar has been, engaged as the primary representative of the East in the past. Now, with his recent military defeats and his reality coming to the surface, I think we need to move past the fact that Haftar is a representative of any faction in Libya. He's proven that he neither wants to be or can be part of any political solution, and continuing to insist that he has to be not only a pillar in this, but have any part of this political solution going forward is a recipe for disaster. And finally, the U.S. really needs to have an alternative track to diplomacy. And this needs to be led primarily by the U.S. Can they do it alone? No, there needs to be a lot of allies that have to work, with this, but we cannot put all of our eggs into this UN-led process alone, because we've been down that path many times. Banking on the UN track only will, with a lot of unknown factors. And I'm definitely not ready to pull the plug on it or say, this is not a viable option. I still think it is probably the most viable option long term. However, the margin for error is very limited, and the time available to experiment is also very limited. So the previous lessons learned we've had 6 special representatives to the Secretary General of the UN. Not all of them have been bad, but at the same time, I think the task and the duty that they've been mandated with is almost an impossible task. The lack of political will at the P5 level, the permanent members of the Security Council, is a primary issue. And, is it worth taking the risk with an exclusive, quote unquote, UN track only without strong leadership? And the answer is no. So with that, I'll open up the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abdallah. That was really interesting and helpful. I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and ask the first question. There have been news reports that some of the Turkish troops that have been fighting on the side of the GNA are actually Syrian militiamen, some of whom have links to terrorist organizations in Syria. Could you speak about that issue specifically, and if those men are indeed in Libya fighting for the GNA, does that concern the GNA? What is the GNA's plan for trying to address that problem?
Sorry about that. It is a fact that the military activity in Libya is further made the situation more complex, and the presence of Syrian fighters is just one little component that needs to be addressed, and it is a consequence, an unfortunate consequence to a bigger problem. So the attack started on April 4th. A bilateral military agreement was signed between Libya and Turkey in November. So 7 months later, and that came about after many, many efforts by the GNA to reach out to many allies, including the US, in order to stop this attack. So fast forward, the makeup of the military presence and the military support, some things you can choose and dictate and mandate, and some things you really can't. So when you've got a militia with thousands of mercenaries from Russia, African countries, and the billions of dollars and the military onslaught that was going on a stone's throw away from the capital, okay? As a matter of fact, it reached a point where it was almost 5 or 6 kilometers away from the city center of Tripoli. You don't get to dictate who comes to help you. So when you're sitting there being robbed and mugged and criminals are attempting to kill you within your house, and someone comes to assist you, you're not going to ask them for their ID and say, who are you and what's your background and where do you come from? So at that particular moment, it's not fair to sit there and analyze this with that particular perspective. So, but now the presence of Syrian fighters under the operations or under the supervision of the Turkish military was there. It is an unfortunate consequence, like I mentioned, to an escalation led by Haftar. It's not something we went out and chose and designed. Now, long term, does this pose an issue for us? Of course, just like the presence of mercenaries from all other countries poses an issue. However, this came as part of a military agreement with a sovereign country, a NATO member country, a U.S. ally, someone that we trust, and someone that we've found to stand by our side at a time of need. So therefore, part of the difficult discussion will be, how do we backtrack this? How do we eliminate the presence of any foreign fighters, not just Syrians? And highlighting this only as a primary issue, not only is it not fair, but I think it's also not a reflection of reality. Now, what has been the consequences of that? From a Libyan perspective, the consequence has been, we found an ally to help us thwart this threat. And we are now having a conversation about what happens next. How do we get rid of Haftar, not only from around Tripoli, but from all of Libya, and to establish a stability and establish an environment where we can go towards a democratic constitutional process. And having these Syrian fighters as part of that military was a price that we had to pay. And when it came to saving Libyan lives, there is nothing that is going to let us back off or slow down or reconsider anything that will save Libyan lives and save the fate of Libya.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Now, on the Turkey issue, we have a question here, a different question about Turkey from Jack Dolgarian. He's asking, what concerns do you have about Turkey forming an agreement with the GNA that established the exclusive economic zone cutting through fellow NATO ally Greece's territory?
I'm sorry, but I had a technical problem here. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, Josh.
No problem. We can all sympathize with technical problems. So this is from Jack Dolgarian. He's asking what concerns you have about Turkey forming an agreement with the GNA that established an exclusive economic zone cutting through fellow NATO ally Greece's territory.
Well, I think the economic agreement is not it's not just a matter of infringing on people's rights or the territories of other countries. I think it's a reflection of very, very limited understanding of what the agreement actually entails. So the Turkish agreement is part of an international process of signing such agreements, maritime agreements. This doesn't infringe on any country's right. This is something that is filed officially with the UN process. Every country has the right to cite such agreements. And by the way, Libya had engaged with Greece in a similar discussion many, many years before it started this discussion with Turkey, and Greece decided or chose not to pursue that option. And at the end of the day, this is something that we are open to. We express our willingness to talk with all Mediterranean countries about how do we mitigate this and how do we make this a win-win situation, and that is still the case. But using this as an excuse to say, oh, this was intended in order to destroy the fate or the benefit or to infringe upon the rights of other countries, I think there's always a hidden message behind it. And I think the whole idea of Turkey establishing a partnership or a strong partnership with Libya concerns a lot of countries. Quite frankly, it concerns us as Libyans as well, because you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. No, this is something that we want to have an open dialogue about and see how we can diversify these relationships economically. So the idea of saying, oh, this is done out of spite or in order to infringe upon the rights of any other country is just not true. And it is really ignoring the elephant in the room. And I think this is something that, unfortunately, some countries are reverted to do that and trying to settle scores on Libyan soil that have nothing to do with Libya.
We have an interesting question here from Ben Shaver from Georgetown University. He's asking, you briefly mentioned the role of Russian bot networks in the conflicts. Can you elaborate on this and on the cyber or information warfare aspects of the conflict more broadly? Yeah,
so the cyber warfare and bot networks, and I don't really understand a lot of this lingo myself, so I'm repeating these phrases, but I understand what the complexity is and what the impact is of this, and I think the United States lived through that and is probably living through that again. So Russia has a very complex and a very powerful weapon that a lot of people don't really understand, and that is the ability to manipulate social media, to manipulate media outlets, to create this network, very complex network of bloggers and bots and trolls and all these other different descriptions. And Libya was not exempt from that. In May of 2019, the Libyan Attorney General issued an arrest warrant for 2 Russians and a Libyan, a third person, involved in a very complex network that was reported later on by many international organizations, including C4ADS and other U.S. organizations that talked about this network. There was a very in-depth report also on BBC and other media outlets talking about this. So the Russian influence goes far beyond just Wagner, goes far beyond the weapons, goes far beyond their attempt to control the oil facilities. So this network is a real threat. And today, these 2, Shugali and the other gentleman who are under arrest in Libya, are the subject of a lot of political posturing and tug of war, not only between Libya and Russia, but also other regional players. And this is not something that we take lightly. Libyan public opinion is still very ripe. Public opinion is very easily swayed by social media, as is most other countries, but especially in Libya, because the abundance of information or the availability of information is quite limited to social media a lot of times. So being able to have that kind of access and manipulating information online can have some very damaging effects. And Russia is using that weapon, unfortunately, to destabilize Libya, as it has in many other countries.
We now have a question from Bert Chapman. He's asking, how much impact, if any, is COVID-19 having on the fighting in Libya?
COVID-19 doesn't know boundaries or doesn't know borders. So yeah, it has the same impact on the individuals and on humans as it has in many different countries. However, in Libya, this is, I guess, a hidden lesson. when you're isolated from the world and it's very difficult to get in and out, the exposure to the virus was not as potent or not as wide as it was in many other countries. However, it's impacted the government's ability to combat this and to take measures in order to be prepared for a wider outbreak. So up until just yesterday, I think, we've had maybe less than 200 cases or so. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's, within the hundreds of total cases. The number of deaths is below 10 still. And the measures that were taken initially, as far as the quarantine, as far as the curfews, as far as, the social distancing measures, were, embraced by the public initially. However, when people saw really that the impact, the human nature, wins out here and people start to become more lax and less strict. Fortunately, relatively speaking, we have not seen a huge spike in numbers. However, a lot of experts are warning that, the worst is yet to come in Libya and in other countries. So we're keeping an eye on that for sure, as many others are. The fighting definitely makes or cripples not only the government, but even the society in general. You don't really get to choose your movements and what your social behavior is throughout the day when you've got bombs falling on your head and you've got the threat of life or the threat of being killed by bombs or by a virus. A lot of people, I think, will take the risk of combating a virus, and this dictates some very threatening or very dangerous behavior. So relatively speaking, it has not impacted us directly, but I think it has been ignored definitely by Haftar and by his militias, because the flights of mercenaries had not stopped coming in from countries in Africa, as well as from Syria and Russian mercenaries. They've completely ignored any initiatives that the government has been trying to do in order to send out equipment and PPE materials to different regions, and they've tried to politicize this as much as they can. But thank God, relatively speaking, it still has not shown, at least from a number standpoint, has not shown as much of a threat that a lot of people were expecting.
Thank you. Next question here is from Samir Jabara. He asks, what do you think the prospects are for any power sharing arrangement that can address security sector reform and the unification of military and security institutions?
Well, I think the prospects are very high, and it's not a very difficult for many reasons, and I'll focus on three. One is when you talk about power sharing, I think it's a very misleading term because I don't think that any one particular entity has enough power consolidated for them to be able to be put in a position to say, oh, you've got to share some of that power. And I think this is a dynamic that has to be understood. Nobody has enough power in order for them to come and say, okay, I'm going to dictate what we're going to negotiate, and here's what I'll share, and here's what I won't share, etc. Libyans in general have proven many different times in 2011 and with the temporary constitutional decree that was adopted, in 2014 with the 2012 with the GNC elections, 2014 with the House of Representatives elections, and then the Libyan political agreement. We've proven that when we are given the right platform and being able to push out a lot of the proxy players, we are able to, we don't have a lot of disagreements. When you really peel the onion, as they say, there's not really deep-rooted disagreements that are tangible or that are factual. There are some. I'm not ignoring the fact that there are, but that there aren't. But the main issues with regards to the resources, funding, equal distribution of wealth is something that has always hung out there. This is something that all Libyans want. Even those who are in the central government understand that from an operational standpoint, we cannot function and continue to have this centralized government with all the different power and authority centralized in Tripoli. Okay, there's got to be a decentralized form of government. So this is something that a lot of people have different views on how to do it, but that is not something that anyone is standing or saying, no, we cannot do that. Everything has to be centralized here within Tripoli. At least anyone who wants, to see a nation stand up on its feet. And then the other element that I wanted to focus on is that achieving a constitutional referendum and going to our subsequent elections is something that everyone agrees on. Okay. And when I say everyone, I'm saying everyone minus anyone who's in Khalifa Haftar's camp, because I think they've proven what they wanted. And therefore, achieving that political solution cannot be built on a pillar saying, okay, Khalifa Haftar represents one side and then everybody else is on the other side, because it's oil and water. And if we insist on launching a political solution with that idea of saying this is what we talk about or what we call power sharing, then it is, one, not understanding the reality of the Libya situation, and two, there's not really a real political will or desire to arrive at a solution. Okay, we're just basically sweeping the problem under the carpet and trying to run forward, hoping that it goes away. So we have to launch the political process with the understanding of that it's a very complex makeup of what will reflect the Libyan people's desire. Okay, without having ballot boxes, it's very difficult to do that. However, there is a mechanism to be able to go across to the different municipalities. You've got a House of Representatives made up of almost 200 people. You've got a Supreme State Council made up of 145 people. I think if you take all of that and mix it up into a pot of some kind of a consortium of electoral body that can draft what does that political process look like to get us to a constitutional referendum, and that has to be the milestone. That has to be the checkpoint, okay, that we get to in order for us to be able to move forward. And then that's what will allow the environment for security reform, for economic reform, for fighting and combating some of the corruption or very deep-rooted corruption that we are facing today. And I think without doing that, and that can be done led by the U.S. If the U.S. steps in and takes or fills that void, the U.S. is the only one that is uniquely positioned because of its relationship with all these other proxy players. And one very important point that I'll make here is that because of the weight that the U.S. brand carries in Libya, so U.S. is associated with a lot of very positive things in Libyan people's minds and in its modern history. Okay, starting with the post-World War II and its independence and the role that the U.S. has played, all the way up to the late John McCain's role and his buying into the Libyan and the young Libyan people's ambition of building a free, democratic, constitutional government, and so on and so on. This is something that is not utilized. This is a political capital that the U.S. owns and has in Libya. That they take several steps behind and let a lot of these proxy players who have other intentions, and we see what the result is. These U.S. allies have become assets for Russia, Iran, Syria, and Libya. This is a very strange dynamic. If this doesn't get the attention of the U.S. administration, I don't know what will. So having these allies play this role and become assets for the objectives of what Russia wants in Libya or in the region, this is definitely something that I think should get the attention of the decision makers. And I think shifting that policy, and I think there has been some signs already, and there's been a huge shift in the last 12 to 14 months between where we were in April 2019 and where we are today. Is it enough? Nowhere near enough. Is it fast enough? No. And I think the pace needs to accelerate of what's happening, and a lot of that needs to come a little bit more to the surface. And that can be also by proxy through some of the U.S. allies who are buying into this ambition, including the Europeans. And I think the Europeans, many officials in the State Department and even the White House have voiced their concern for the negative role that the Europeans have played as well. And the U.S. continues to push Europe to take on a more positive role. However, waiting on that to happen, that's, I don't think it's in anyone who's on this web call is going to be in their lifetime to see that kind of a shift happen. So I think the U.S. is the only one who is very well positioned to be able to shift the pendulum here and get us back on track in order to arrive at the constitutional democracy in a stable country that can provide a lot of fruits and benefits, primarily to the Libyan people first and foremost, and then ultimately for all of its friends, allies, and neighbors.
Well, thanks very much. An interesting question here from Tom Hill from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Both Turkey and Russia seem to be positioning themselves in Libya to gain concessions from the other in Syria. Can you speak to the linkage between these two conflicts and the prospects for peace in Libya, absent a larger compromise on Syria?
Yeah, and Tom, it's an excellent question. And Tom has been someone who's following Libya for a long time and understands the complexity of how Libya has been a pawn, unfortunately, in the region for such players such as Russia and others in Turkey. And unfortunately, that has been the price that the Libyan people have had to pay. And however, I think the situation in Syria has a lot of different factors and a lot of different parameters than what is happening in Libya. So having a correlation of what will happen here will also happen there, I don't think that's necessarily a reality. However, if Turkey is not able to gain more concessions in Libya, meaning concessions from Russia, will they be put in a more difficult position in Syria? Possibly. I don't have an understanding, in-depth at least understanding of what the end game is for Turkey or Russia in Syria. And I'm not really that concerned about that. But what I'm concerned about is that Libya's deliverables, or the deliverables that Libya can provide for its allies, are some very positive deliverables that all of these people need, including players such as Russia. However, banking on a Khalifa Haftar-like scenario will guarantee that none of them will achieve these deliverables. Okay, so a stable political situation in Libya will enable Turkey, Russia, and many others to be able to benefit economically and be able to reap some of these fruits. However, destabilizing Libya, and this is where I think the Russian role comes in, is they feel like an unstable Libya prolonging the crisis gives them the upper hand, because they don't mind dealing with illegitimate militias and outlaws and dealing in the black market and going and breaking every single rule, whereas other countries, have other standards and other constituencies to answer to, including in Turkey. So therefore, it's a very complex dynamic, and unfortunately, Libya sometimes comes out on the short end of the stick there when it comes to these, political posturing in the region of, give me this and I'll give you that. And this is something that we cannot bank on. As Libyans, we can only control what happens in Libya and what the fate of Libyans is. And, we would love to be able to listen to the concerns and issues that other partners and other, allies have in other regions, but there's very little that we can actually do to impact that.
Thanks very much. Next question now is from Chris Felt from U.S. Africa Command. What do you think it will take for the different sides to compromise on a political agreement that will serve the common welfare of all actors? Are there new, younger national leaders emerging who can draw them together?
So yeah, Chris, I think what will it take? And I think we answered that earlier on in saying that a U.S. role, a strong U.S. leadership stepping in to fill this void, I think is something that it's the path of least resistance and also the quickest path to be able to arrive at providing a platform for these young leaders to actually step up and play a role in drawing this up. And going back to the dynamics of former Gaddafi regime, Khalifa Haftar, and then everyone else is going to come up with the same formula. The Libyan society and the Libyan political topology, if you will, is not that. We've moved past that many, many years ago. Even hanging our hat on the tribal makeup and saying, okay, tribal representation into a political solution, that is not going to work. And I'll give you a perfect example for that. In 2012, the GNC elections that I participated in had over 65% participation from Libyans across the country, across different generations. Okay, the young generation participation in that was very high. What did we get? We got a makeup, and I'm not here evaluating how successful or unsuccessful the GNC was. I'm just talking about the makeup of the membership of it. You had people from very small tribes in the east coming out on top in the elections in some of the cities who are pretty, homogenous when it comes to the tribal makeup. A city in El Beila, for example, that has the Ra'asa tribe is the primary representation. You had people who are not from that tribe who were elected. And the same thing happened in many other cities. Fast forward to 2014, where you had a less than a 17% representation or participation, in the elections. You had a very polarized tribal makeup, so you have a very few people, hiding behind the tribal representation and standing up and saying people such as Aguila Saleh today, who was supposedly the head of the House of Representatives, yet he's conducting his meeting with tribal leaders from his own tribe. He's having his meetings in his own personal, living room and sitting in a very traditional, tribal setting when he is an elected member and heading up a legislative body, supposedly. So this is the issue. And I think we have to move past that dynamic. We have to be able to empower the young Libyans, empower people who are actually buying into the civilian government, buying into a constitutional form of government that will basically lay out the rules and the laws that everyone can participate in. And I think this is something that the U.S. is in a unique position to do, either through the UN-led process or an alternative track 2 political process. And I think bringing people from the HOR, from the Supreme State Council, from the municipalities who are all elected members, and having that be the core representation of a platform to be able to move forward in order to get us to a constitutional referendum, that is the formula I think that will work.
Next question here is from Mangi Daoudi from the Libyan American Alliance. Egypt was a big supporter to Haftar and his attack on Tripoli and his ambitions in Libya more generally. Now that the tides have turned, what role do you think Egypt still has in a political settlement in Libya? And what's your opinion on the role of Tunisia and Algeria?
Look, I think the role of all of Libya's neighbors is important. And I think establishing stability and arriving at a political solution within Libya cannot happen without the buy-in and the support of all of its neighbors, no exclusion, including Egypt, who is part of the problem, who is part of the military onslaught. And they bet on a losing horse. And this is the situation that Egypt is in today. They found themselves betting on a losing horse. That horse has come back to them with, all these wounds and basically beat up and not able to deliver all the promises that they've set. And they found themselves in a situation between a rock and a hard place, between, their other allies in this axis of evil, who are insisting that Egypt continues to play this logistical role and continues to provide weapons and open up its borders to Haftar, and between a lot of other, including some of their military intelligence leadership, who are saying, no, this is not only a losing horse, this is a destructive horse. And we need to be able to establish a relationship with the legitimate government, sit at the negotiating table and represent the Egyptian interest. And this is something that is welcome. Now, can Egypt go from a country providing all these weapons and actually carrying out airstrikes and killing Libyans to a peace negotiator right away? No, of course not. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. There's got to be some trust building. There's got to be some tangible steps taken by Egypt in order for them to show that commitment that they're willing to be part of a long-term political process. But at this point, Egypt continues to be a problem, continues to be a source of the problem. And until they end that immediately, and I think they've started with this idea of bringing Aguila Saleh and Khalifa Haftar in a very orchestrated, I'm not even going to call it initiative. It's not an initiative. It was a show, an exhibition this past Saturday, where they basically brought out Khalifa Haftar to show that he is no longer their pony. He is no longer the horse that they're betting on, and he is no longer the person that's representing the East in their opinion. And I think that was achieved. Now, the idea of this whole political proposal that Sisi threw out there, that's a bunch of baloney. That just completely ignores the whole Libyan political agreement. And I don't think that's necessarily really the gist of the proposal out there. And like I said, it's basically to put Egypt out there as a peace broker, and this is something that nobody is buying. Egypt needs to do a lot more and needs to take a lot more tangible steps, including closing the border for all this military support, continuing to put pressure on Aguila Saleh and the House of Representatives to operate as one body. You've got more than half of the House of Representatives who have refused to recognize Aguila Saleh as their head. That is something that needs to be addressed. And then Egypt also needs to take tangible steps with the government of national accord in order to show their intent to be a part of the solution going forward. And there's many, many, many steps that still need to be taken. And until then, Egypt will still be seen as part of the problem. And unfortunately, Libya's stabilization, a lot of that relies or it depends on Egypt's change in behavior. And this is something that we hope that the U.S. can play a role in continuing to exert pressure. And I think the administration has already started.
Thanks. So a similar question from our own Nicole Robinson here at Heritage. She's saying, how do you think the military support to Haftar that the UAE and Jordan have provided will impact bilateral relations with Libya in the future?
Well, again, it is left a lot of wounds. Okay, so this military support is not just a matter of supporting one military force versus the other. This is military support that led to thousands of lives being lost, billions of dollars of destruction. It's led to the instability of the country and tearing up the fabric of the Libyan society. So the impact that this role has played cannot, we can't just turn the page and ignore all of this and say, okay, let's, let bygones be bygones and move forward as much as maybe some people would like to. I think the benchmark will be what is in the Libyan people's interest. Does Libya really have any interest in a direct bilateral relationships with the UAE? Very seriously, it's very difficult to find one thing that the Libyan society or Libyan people need from the UAE that nobody else has. So we are not really in need of establishing relationships whatsoever or reconciling with the UAE, at least in the short term. Now, in the long term, if things change and the UAE goes through many different changes, that's a different story, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. However, today, the UAE has been nothing but a source of evil, a source of death, a source of corruption, a source of enabling a military dictator and his network to thwart the ambitions of the Libyan people to establish a democratic, constitutional, prosperous country. And for Jordan, it's a little bit of a different situation. I think Jordan is in a lot of their fate is not necessarily controlled by them. I think a lot of this is imposed on them. However, they've, including in the UN panel of expert reports, it showed how they've played a logistical role and played as a hub for a lot of these weapons flowing into Khalifa Haftar. And I think Jordan needs to answer to that. They need to step up and admit that role and admit that they made a mistake. And then we can start talking about reconciling that. The relationship between Libya and Jordan is a lot healthier than it is with Libya and the UAE. I think in the short term and even medium term, Jordan leads Libya. And I think Libya, to a certain extent, needs a good, solid relationship with Jordan. However, what they did is something that they have to be held accountable for and they have to answer to. And this is something that I think can be reconciled in the immediate future if the Jordanian government is willing to step up and take responsibility for that. And I think there are some level-headed, very strong, patriotic and positive players in the Jordanian circle of influence and the decision-making process to where that can be a reality. I can't say the same for the UAE.
Thanks. And we're pretty rapidly running out of time here. So I'll again use the moderator's privilege and ask the last question. We've talked a lot about, or a fair amount about the Russian mercenaries, but obviously there's other mercenaries involved here, specifically Chadians and Sudanese. The Sudan, of course, has a new government. Could you discuss a little bit about what is the GNA's relationship with the new Sudanese government, given that there are Sudanese mercenaries fighting on the side of Haftar, two separate groups actually of Sudanese mercenaries, and with whom do you speak specifically within the Sudanese government, because you obviously have a military component and a civilian component. And then finally, what is Haftar's relationship with the Sudanese government?
Well, I mean, I'm not really that directly involved in the diplomatic relationships between our government and Sudan. So I'm speaking from my personal perspective and from my experience also as a Libyan living in exile in Sudan at a very early part of my life. So I have a very unique affection for Sudan, for the Sudanese people. And also, understand that they've gone through and they're going through a lot of things that we went through or are going through as well. What's happening as far as the mercenaries that have, made their way into Libya, and how responsible is the Sudanese government, the current government, in that? That's something that is very difficult to answer. However, there are some elements in the government, such as Hemedti, who is one of the militia leaders that made his way into the political settlement in Sudan and is part of the decision-making within the government. It's proven that he was a very big part of these forces, but it was basically a guns for hire kind of thing. The UAE or Saudi Arabia provided the funds for that, and he provided the boots and the weapons. And I don't think it necessarily goes beyond that. I don't think there's a fundamental ideological objective behind this. I don't think there's a fundamental economic objective, meaning to the impacting the Sudanese government. It's impacting the pockets of a lot of these mercenaries or the mercenary leaders and the network of outlaws that are in the region. And I think we have to deal with this, with the Sudanese government as this is a joint problem. This is not just a problem for Libyans. These weapons and these mercenaries that are brought into Libya, once the funds dry out and the pipeline is shut off as far as who's paying them, okay, are these people going to just disappear? No, they're going to go somewhere else and be a source of a problem, including inside of Sudan. So this is something that has to be addressed jointly with the Sudanese government. I don't know that we have enough confidence or trust with Hemedti himself, someone who's lived all of his life as an outlaw and as a mercenary to a certain extent, and as a broker for military activity and outside the law. I think we need to go beyond that and deal with the political civilian leadership in Sudan, because I think they're the ones who have the mutual interest that we have in establishing a stability, not only on our borders, but overall within the region. And again, the proxy player role here, meaning the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt's influence on what's happening in Sudan is not much different from what's happening in Libya. So I think the Sudanese people are victim of the same interventions that we are facing in Libya, and I think the Libyan government and the Sudanese government understand that, and this is where the opportunity for combating this issue jointly. And again, I think this is something that is definitely workable with the Sudanese government.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time here. I want to thank you so much for joining us. This is obviously a pivotal moment in the Libyan struggle. We hope that this will lead to stability and peace, and that the bloodshed and the violence there will stop. Thank you again. It's so useful to hear from someone who's so heavily involved in the day-to-day, and we appreciate your frankness. Thank you for taking some hard questions, tackling those, and we hope you'll come back and visit us at some point. And thank you to all of our listeners out there. It was great to have you join us. Thank you for the excellent questions. We had some stacked up here, but unfortunately ran a bit out of time. But appreciate your participation as well.
Thank you, Josh, and I want to thank the Heritage Foundation, everybody, and the Heritage Foundation for this opportunity, and hope that this dialogue continues and that we take some tangible steps. And I call on those who are from the U.S. government and on the Hill as well, listening, to reach out and to see how we can continue to build on this. And I think we've got the positive momentum going in the right direction. Heritage Foundation has played a good role in this thus far, and I think can continue to do that in trying to influence the decision makers within DC, and I appreciate your effort and the entire Heritage Foundation's team's effort.
Well, thank you, and you can see on your screen there the Twitter handles for both of us. That's in today's day and age frequently a good way to be into contact if you want to. So thank you again to you all. Thank you especially to Mr. Abdallah, and hope to see you soon, and stay safe.
Thank you.